Um, okay, that was what we were waiting for. Thank you for coming. Thanks for coming in person, by the way, and thanks to Zoom people zooming in. You've probably heard this because you have a seminar series, but this is exciting to see people in person. Today I want to talk about two streams of research in forest dynamics that have developed over about 50 years, and that started in different places and developed largely sort of in parallel but independently, and are now coming together. One of those I'll call biodiversity, and the other I'll call global modeling. So I kind of want to give you a sense of the history of these, and I find it really fascinating, me being a demographer and coming from the biodiversity side of this, to see not only meet people that have studied forest dynamics and thought about it as a community for 50 years, but have done it in a very different way than we do it, and us kind of needing each other now with climate change and kind of the imperative of climate change. So let's see. I can do the whole thing on this slide if I have to, but sorry. I'm using the arrows. There we go. I think I'll just take that. Yeah, so the first path I'm going to talk about is the biodiversity path. So as Claire said, I'm a forest demographer, and so a lot of the data that I use in my research is from inventory plots. So these are plots where individual trees are tagged. They're followed over time. They're identified as species. They're measured every 5 years. It's a very fine-grained approach to forests. And these plots started to be set up in the 60s and 70s, and it's kind of expanded globally. And people have long known that tropical forests are incredibly diverse, but I think when the numbers started coming in from these plots, it was surprising. I mean, it certainly surprises me to think about it. And to kind of give you an example of what kind of diversity I'm talking about, this is just, I use Google Earth to look at two sections of forests that are 25 hectares each. So this is kind of what a larger, a Smithsonian forest geoplot might be. They're both intact old growth forests. One is in Washington State in the United States, the Pacific Northwest, and the other is in the Amazon. And they're both similar stature, so they're high biomass forests, very tall trees. The Washington plot probably has around 25 to 30 species in it. The Amazon plot probably has about 1,200 species. So we're talking about almost 2 orders of magnitude. And so that is striking, but to kind of put it in further context, because numbers mean different things to different groups. If you study the microbiome or something, then 1,200 isn't that much. But this plot would be pretty much in the center of Montpellier, so the old city. So it would take up a bunch of the old city, and you'd have 1,200 species there. And if that's not impressive, think about Europe. Europe probably has 300 to 500 species in total. And so in central Montpellier, we have 1,200. And in fact, the equivalent of 1,200 species is probably what North America has. So Mexico, US, and Canada. So all of those species packed downtown, and we're walking around between them in the cafe. So that is striking, and it raises two questions coming from that. So one of them is more for evolutionary biologists and evolutionary ecologists, which is, how do these systems emerge? Where do they come from? How does allopatric speciation happen? Is it polyploidy? And what are the rules of diversification to create these systems? But from the community ecology perspective, it's how do so many species coexist? And so, knowing these are fairly stable systems, meaning, the Amazon we see has been the Amazon that way for quite a long time. And knowing just a bit about community ecology theory, we know that just small competitive advantages of one species over another, of 10 species, 100 species over the rest, should lead to the exclusion of the inferior species. And so seeing 1,200 species in this small area is just it's an inspiration for theoretical thinking about coexistence. And I'm going to introduce just one concept about how to handle this, is just the idea of trade-offs. And I just want to divert quickly to this because it comes up later. Trade-offs are one way to think about competition being managed in a system. So if you had a species that's drought tolerant and a species that's vulnerable to drought, Well, they can coexist as long as droughts are happening with a frequency and intensity that keeps one up and the other down and reverses it. Because the trade-off would be, for example, if you're drought tolerant, if there's no drought, whatever structures you've invested in to make yourself drought tolerant are probably a penalty when there's no drought compared to something that's not concerned with droughts. So there's 2 species, 1 example. How many examples do you need for 1,200 species? I mean, a lot. It can be an industry. And so I'm just listing a few, and these aren't organized in any fundamental way. I think many of you know of these or many other modes of coexistence, but you can have niche partitioning along many axes, pollination syndromes, soils, etc. Neutral population drift, so the neutral theory, just random chance whether you live or die or born. Conspecific negative density dependence is kind of a disease model where species hurt themselves more than others. And intermediate disturbance, just another example of ways in which certain systems can maintain a number of species over time. Each of these, I'm always surprised at how each of these, when they're introduced, is either implicitly but sometimes explicitly presented as the answer to the question, to the problem. Like, this is a solution. And I find that just, I don't buy it, but actually I like all of them. They're great. And so, in American standardized tests, we always have an all of the above. And like, I'm very fine with all of the above. And all of the above can be a list 100 long. When there's 1,200 species and a dynamic world, I have no problem believing this, partly because, they're all good stories. In other words, if you hear them told, like I just did about the drought, or, hurricanes coming now and again, and you're like, yeah, that makes sense. That's a good story. But further, these different mechanisms have been tested. There have been experiments, analytical studies of data, simulations, depending on the mechanism, that have demonstrated that they can exist, or that pattern is seen in nature that's, that would be linked to this explanation. But also there's a lot of noise. And so for any of the signals, you always see lots of noise. And it can be ascribed to error or just, something out there that's amorphous. But I actually think that it's just the other processes, and there's no experiment, analysis, simulation that can answer all these questions at the same time. Therefore, every time you're trying to focus on one method of coexistence, the others are just messing with your data. It's the different time scale, it's a different spatial scale, what have you. But overall, I think I'm comfortable with species are very diverse, and in a sense, this movement over decades of species coexistence theory, which is still important, and I think it's shifted its importance away from the answering the question about the 1,200 species and one forested area to a very different question that started emerging, I would only say like 15 to 20 years ago, and that's climate change. And it sounds weird to think about it now, but when I started my PhD, climate change was something that was going to affect forests in 100 years, in 2100, with CO2, all the experiments were CO2 levels of 800 parts per million. It affected butterflies then, like, wow, the butterflies are moving up in mountains. But forests just seemed so long-lived that that was just down the way. And 10 years later, we started seeing examples and evidence of forests also being affected by climate change, which makes you go back to the coexistence literature and theory and think of it in a slightly different way. Because instead of just musing about the marvels and the miracle of biodiversity, you start looking at it and saying, well, which of these theories of coexistence might lend some insight into who stops coexisting? If this competition balance is so critical, then how will new climates, novel conditions, tip the balance potentially, so that we start losing species that have been maintained in these systems for millions of years. This is a very difficult program because if you're starting to talk about, which traits, which features of these systems might explain what could happen in the future globally, then you're really leaving the comfort of these plots and these individual measurements. And so, functional traits are an example of a way in which we might get proxies, kind of easier proxies for these kinds of trade-offs. that we could extrapolate faster. In other words, instead of having to do an experiment, a drought experiment, if we could just get the leaf features that tell us how you respond to drought, then we don't have to wait for a drought or experiment or what have you. But the analyses and the experiments are just not possible, and the traits can't really be established that easily without that kind of interrogation. And I think that one of the conclusions, at least myself and I think others that work in my field feel, is that maybe we need simulations, because this is, if we're going to talk globally and we're going to talk tens of thousands of species and we're going to talk climates we don't see now, then the experiment and the analysis from data just aren't enough. So we're starting to think about global simulations of these systems. So that's when the second path, because when we're thinking about this, we're starting to meet these people and read these articles about people simulating forests that have been doing that for decades also. And so dynamic global vegetation models evolved and emerged over, again, almost a similar time period, that a very different origin, very different group of people and different thinking going into the development. And so if we started with forest plots, this thinking started perhaps with the Mauna Loa Observatory, where in 1958 it was established and they started measuring atmospheric CO2. This was an incredible instrument because, one, the instrument itself had precision, but it was also in a perfect location, top of a large mountain volcano in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, that it was capturing the mixing of the atmospheric carbon really well. In other words, it wasn't local, it wasn't in this room, it wasn't near a city. It was saying this is the state of the atmosphere. And sure enough, soon after it was established, even in the 60s and early 70s, it's like, this is going up. So these measurements that we establish are starting to go up. And these are atmospheric scientists, and atmospheric scientists know what that means, because they know CO2, they know the physics of CO2 as being a greenhouse gas, they know the geological history of the Earth, and so they know that as this goes up, just like it has in Earth's past, temperature will go up associated with this. Now, the problem, of course, is that if you start saying things like CO2 is going up like this, we have a very precise estimate. Temperature should be associated with that based on past geological records and some physics. And people say, well, how much? When? And if you use the geological record, they can say with sort of precisions like between 2 and 10 degrees in 10 and 50,000 years. And that's just not enough. It's not enough for people that are being told that this very precise measurement of CO2 will lead to temperature increase. So they can't do experiments. The data are just this, and then past fossil records of plants and stuff like that, and cores. So they need to simulate. So very early on, they were in a position that the biodiversity folks were not, and it had to be a simulation. So they started building Earth system models, and it started just with the carbon cycles of land surface. So this is, by the way, this is a paper by Rosie Fisher and Charlie Coven from 2017, GCB. And if it were a TED Talk, I'd know how to do this elegantly, but I'm just going to slowly push this thing out because it goes over time. This is the 70s, the 80s, 90s. But it's the evolution of land surface models. It's a really neat paper about the development of these models and how they grew and why. But so the land surface energy model is the first pass. It's like, look, there's sun coming in, there's reflectance, absorbance, carbon moves into the oceans and out, et cetera. But that's not enough, because we know that large parts of the Earth are green, and you have to handle, if you're going to do the carbon cycle, you have to handle photosynthesis. And so there became a part of the 80s in the model called the plant canopies, and that's a leaf. You can tell it's a leaf, and that's really how they saw the world. Is that things that photosynthesized were that. They called it the big leaf model. And so basically they looked at the world, and this includes oceans, and anything that brings in and light and photosynthesizes, they treat as a singular leaf. And had the biodiversity scientists known this at the time, that they were treating all the precious forests of the world as a single leaf, they would clutch their pearls in horror, but they didn't know about it, they didn't care about it. These are independent schemes. But you can say that's horrible. How could you possibly treat the whole world like a leaf, a single leaf? But it's actually not a bad start, because photosynthesis is the driver of everything, and it's a fascinating process. And in a way, it's a miracle. If there's a biodiversity miracle, there's a photosynthesis miracle. And simply, it takes carbon dioxide. The plants take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which is from the air, which is important. You add water, some nutrients and stuff, and light, and you get a sugar out. So you get a sugar and this oxygen. So the thing that's understated in this is that light thing. That light makes it look like a flashlight or something. We were talking about the sun. It's like this is a fusion ball constantly beaming energy down on the Earth. It's there all the time. It's relatively free. I mean, there's always capitalism and everything, but it's somewhat free. The plants can access it all the time, and it's amazing that basically from CO2 and water with this free source of energy, plants, and I think of it as kind of knitting together carbon into these little scarves of chains that can be sugars, starches, etc. So here are these little scarf chains, and these are the simple, and they get more complex, of course. But what's amazing is it's not just the structure of the carbon being knitted together. It's that there's energy in this, and it's energy that's accessible, of course. And so respiration is the flip side. And so if you take those sugars and you add oxygen with a little bit of activation energy, you get the CO2s and the water. The CO2 goes back to the atmosphere, and you get the energy released. So you have the sugar, you metabolize it, you breathe out oxygen, CO2 and water, and you can do something with it. And that's, I find that just amazing that all of the carbon compounds around us, all life, has this kind of secret energy locked in that can be used. And that's why there are food chains, food webs, where even complex tissues with carbons like proteins, muscles can be broken down. We get the energy from it, and the carbon is released. And so that's the carbon cycle, and kind of the amazing way in which the carbon cycle drives life on the planet. Of course, the ghosts of life on the planet from 100, 200 million years ago is also in play now. And it's the same concept, meaning all those starches and sugars and proteins and lipids fell to the bottom of the ocean, got compacted and crushed over 100 million years, and became fossil fuels. So when we draw them out, the same principle applies. They're chains of carbon. We process them so that we can light them really easily. They give off energy and put CO2 back in the atmosphere. So it's the same thing as sugars, but propane, acetone, ethanol, they're sending CO2 into the atmosphere. So that's same game, slightly different thing. There's another molecule that some plants make, and it's still a carbon chain, it's still knitted together, but it's more like an Afghan or something. And it's lignin. And so this is the same principle as your glucose and sucrose, except obviously it's really complicated. It looks like it's hard to digest. It looks like it's not easy, and it isn't. This is wood. This is the structure of trees, and it's an interesting molecule because, of course, it does obey all those other kind of themes of the sucrose or the butane, and that if you dry out a log and you throw it on a fire, if it's hot enough, it burns, and it all breaks down, gives off CO2, and you have heat. But it takes a lot more activation energy for that, and in fact, in this form, it's not very palatable to a lot of the things that break down sucroses and glucoses, et cetera, cellulose. And it can last a long time, both as living tissue and as dead tissue. So for the modelers thinking about the pace of carbon exchange and temperature and modeling that temperature change in the time frame of decades or centuries, this becomes an important molecule, because when things get into this, they don't come out as easily. So how do you start doing that? Well, in the 90s, you start seeing plant functional types come out. So in other words, instead of just a leaf, there has to be some differences. It may just be like take a leaf and put it on a stem of wood so that you have a pool of carbon that stays longer. But you also may start to differentiate between the leaves. And so from a biodiversity perspective, this is the right direction. Let's start seeing the differences that matter, that we know exist out in the world. We'd be disappointed, to see actually what these plant functional types might be. So here's some plant functional types. This is from one of the Earth system models. I guess this is a few years ago. But this is common to these big models. So you have needle-leaf evergreen trees, needle-leaf evergreen tree boreal, at boreal temperate, deciduous tree boreal. That's large, by the way, because it's needle-leaf and it's deciduous. It's large. That's one species. Big species, all over Russia and Canada, but still one. But the tropical forests now are two of them. So we have broadleaf evergreen and broadleaf deciduous trees. Those are the two tropical PFTs. So you have kind of dry tropical forest, and all the wet tropical forest is one PFT. So that would be disappointing in itself, to see that you're starting to break up the world into to different things, and you have large, and then you have all tropical moist forests. But it's even more disappointing when you see kind of what these PFTs mean. So this is an equation. This will be from these technical manuals. It's an equation for a root fraction, blah, blah, blah. And there's a bunch of parameters. So then the parameters, those values are given, right? And so when you look up the values, you see these PFTs and you see what the values are. These are just two root, I don't even know what they are, but two root parameters. But when you look at it, you're like 7, 6, 7, 2, 1, 2, 1.5. You're going to be further disappointed in these PFTs, because it seems like that's kind of made up. Like you'd expect like a 2.72 or something. Like, did you really measure this? Like, what is this root parameter? And are you just changing the units to help differentiate like the boreal zone or something? The answer is probably yes. So clearly we want better plant functional types. We want more realistic representation. So it's not good enough just to diversify the types. We want to see the diversity capture some of the processes we're talking about in these forests. But there's two main reasons why that's not easily done and why there's a lot of resistance to doing it. The first is that these PFTs are housed in dynamic global vegetation models. These are really big models that do all kinds of stuff with hydrology and everything. So when we clamor for a PFT, it's not that funny, but when we clamor for a PFT, we're asking to start doing things with a fairly complex model here. But further, these models, these DGVMs, are dynamic because they interface with Earth system models. So in other words, the Earth system, it's dynamic in that they go back and forth with feedbacks. So like every 15 minutes, an Earth system model will tell the DGVM the temperature of the canopy layer, the amount of moisture coming in, humidity, say, maybe some hydrology in the soil. The DGVM takes those inputs, runs its process of like photosynthesis, growth allocation, carbon assortment, and then spits back evapotranspiration. Like we transpired this much water, so take this back, atmosphere. The atmosphere says thank you, and then clouds build up over the Amazon, the simulated Amazon, as transpiration throughout the day produces this incredible belt of moisture and cooling, etc. So that's how they work. So you start messing with that, and you're messing with a very complex group. And this isn't just, unlike a lot of our labs where we get together, we work really hard on a project, and we're thinking about some papers or a grant. They have a higher purpose at this level. So they're putting DGVMs linked to Earth system models. And here's a bunch of acronyms for you guys. And these Earth system models, there are a whole bunch of them from all over the world, slightly different, same intent, same global representation of all physical and chemical processes and biological processes. They get joined in the Community Model Intercomparison Project. That's CMIP. So every 5 years, CMIP has a big experiment that they do with these simulator models, so these Earth system models. And the experiments are like, let's raise emission by this much. Let's have land use change this much. So they come up with these experiments, these designs, and they run all the models, and they take the results and they send them to the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so the IPCC grabs all of these model results of the future of the Earth based on these scenarios, as well as looking at other literature and data. And every 5 years, they produce an assessment report. Every 5 years, so we're at AR6 just came out last year. And so, every 5 years, you guys will see in the news, like the assessment report came out from the IPCC, and they're saying the Himalayan glaciers will melt. There's a 50% chance they'll melt completely by 2075. Like, where did that come from? It came from these models. It came from a bunch of models that they can say, balancing all this, we see again and again that this is the melting rate of those glaciers. So we have very complex models that have to perform every 5 years stably to go into incredible policy implied results and inference. And that policy is not just about forests, it is about melting glaciers. It's about the solar caps, it's about ozone in the atmosphere, et cetera. So that's one reason why when we're like, divide up the PFTs, they're like, we cannot break this model. And if anybody's worked in simulations at all of any kind of complexity, you know that one, you can break the model easily. Two, you can not know why you broke it. And three, if you do break it, you can't do anything with it. It's not like a bad field season that you can kind of recover data. It's just like it's useless if the model doesn't work. So that they're conservative this way. The other thing is that they come from a culture, a view of nature that's very much from these laboratories of plant physiology and metabolic properties. And they believe that they know that it's a diverse world, but they believe that if they can really get all the details right about an organism, the big leaf, for example, if they can get every electron transport and chemical transition down, then they pretty much have the plants of the world. So that, and I think of this as the roaming leaf approach, where instead of having different trees, you just have a tree that's so well resolved that you can move it from Montpellier to the Amazon. And because it's so good at handling all the physical properties and environment, the fact that it is now in a place that's aseasonal, that has a lot more rain, that has competition from other large trees, that has a different nutrient flow, it's going to grow like an Amazon tree instead of like a Montpellier tree. And if you brought a Dipteryx from Amazon and brought it here, it would be drier, there would be a cold season, it wouldn't grow as much, it would look different. And so you can move the leaf around the world and capture diversity just by the environmental inputs into it. And and that works to enough of a degree, and it's stable and easier that's a common use of it. Until it doesn't work, of course. And so some colleagues that work on a model called FATES, which is part of the E3SM model in the Department of Energy in the US. I was in a meeting with them and they started talking about how to handle the boreal growth spurt or something. I'm like, what's this? And basically they moved the leaves around, and so they moved their boreal forest had leaves that were probably too much like an Amazonian forest or something. I don't know the details, and I don't think they know the details. All they know is that their boreal forests were growing way too fast. And remember, you're supposed to move a plant up there, whatever this herb plant, meta plant, and it's supposed to be dark half the year, low light, cold, boggy soil, so it shouldn't grow fast. But these were just growing fast, and they don't know why. And that's a really important thing to avoid. If they were growing faster than we believe any of these forests should grow, you have tree encroachment on tundra, you have albedo heats up the surface more, melting of the permafrost. So you have these quick cycles. So little things, a little mistake somewhere in there can really all of a sudden melt off all the tundra before any other model is telling you that. So what do? They just say, okay, if you're above a certain latitude, don't grow that much. Like this, they call it the climate envelope model, and it's much like kind of biogeography climate envelopes. We're just we don't have time to get this right. We just cannot have these forests going crazy. So they hardwired in. My point just being, they know that's not, they don't want to do that. They want to know the processes that correctly capture boreal zone in these transition zones. They want to correctly capture tropical forest diversity. And so I think that's kind of where we arrive now, where we know we need to simulate globally to predict the dynamics of our speciose forests. And they know they need to really think about how to better capture distinctions in forests so that they don't have to do these kind of very crude blocking off mechanisms. They're constantly working to advance the models and take in other things. And I think this is part of the issue where we could be impatient about not handling tropical forests, because they're doing lakes, rivers, wetlands, urban, land use change, crops, irrigation, and nutrients. Demographic vegetation is up there. We're rooting for that, but we'll see. We'll see how that manifests. But these models are becoming complex in a number of different dimensions. They're starting to incorporate human economic systems into the models and feedbacks. So we need to think about how best to take the knowledge that we have. I'm speaking we, meaning the biodiversity, the forest ecologists that think about biodiversity a lot, and demonstrate and translate that to these models. Because to be honest, it's, we can sit in a meeting with them and it's really fun, but this is a one-way thing. They are not breaking down this model and rebuilding it for tropical forests. It's got to be on these terms. If we want to use, and we don't have to, but if we want to use these engines to predict the future of tropical forests over the next 100 years, they're very good at a lot of things. So the last two sections, I just want to quickly talk about a project that's just finishing that I think demonstrates the proof of this possibility, and then a project that's just starting that I hope will do a better job of integrating kind of biodiversity into these models. So the first project is a study led by David Bowman, who's here at AMA. Claire and I are on this project as well, and it's an investigation of a really great data set for biodiversity modeling and for the demographic side of things. And it's multiple plots that were measured over 50 years. So it's 50 years of data, multiple plots where individual trees were monitored from many different species in northeastern Australia. This is moist tropical forest, and it's this corner of moist tropical forest in Australia. And the plots are on an elevation gradient, so they do also change. So you have a lot of different dimensions here. And so we looked at mortality over the 50 years, and the take home is this. You have mortality risk on the left, and then from the 70s on to just recently, you have the average mortality across all the plots and species. And what's interesting is you see a kind of a stable and a very tight low mortality, 1%, and then a kind of a loosening of the system. And it's numerically, it doesn't look like that much, because it goes from about 1% to about 2%. But as a demographer, I know mortality is compounding annually. So if these two rates are to be maintained, a 2% versus 1% increase in mortality is a doubling of mortality. It's a halving in life expectancy. So if your projected lifespan at 2% is half of what it would be at 1%. And therefore, it's also a halving of carbon residence time. So in other words, if carbon stays in the system 100 years under 1%, it stays in the system 50 years under 2%. So these are the kind of numbers and patterns that are important to think about if we're thinking globally about potential changes, carbon cycle changes, species loss, etc. Now, I won't go into any real details, but the culprit that seems to align with a lot of the data is vapor pressure deficit, which has increased across this region over those years. So good, it matches something that we would expect. Vapor pressure deficit is atmospheric demand for water, so it's a stressful thing. So as it goes up, it can be more stressful on trees, and so stress can lead to mortality. Further, so when we look at, so is this one species? Is this one plot that's driving all this? And no, so across plots, this is happening, and across species, it's happening. And yes, and across species, it's happening. The take-home message here is just that species differ in their response to this, potentially response to this VPD. They differ in their participation in this mortality trend. And what that means is that whatever it is, VPD is a good potential indicator, is there are different species responses to these changes over the last 50 years, which indicates maybe two PFTs. Maybe species are different. And you need to distinguish between, in just this one case, species that do versus species that don't respond to these changes. But we did some additional analyses I won't go into, and that demonstrated that if you look at where species tend to be towards the edge of their VPD limits and their ranges, and then look across the plots that we have, so for species that are in more plots, as they move towards higher VPD plots, their vulnerability became greater. In other words, those species that are vulnerable became more vulnerable as they increased towards higher VPD. That sounds a lot like the roaming leaf approach to things, because you don't need a PFT for every site. You just have to get the one PFT right in its details and capturing that VPD stress. Then you can move the species in space and it will reflect the data. It will become more vulnerable without having to change anything because you've got the mechanism right. Likewise, we would hope that if you get the mechanism right, you can push it into time, project it into time, and as VPD changes over time, you get the same right answer. Because you'd have, yes, a unique PFT, but one that captures this mechanism well enough to be generalizable. So you're not stuck plot to plot. So that's great, but if and maybe when a global modeler comes to us and says, super, let's start working together, really excited about these two PFTs, give me parameters, we have some functional traits that were collected one time for some species that don't really have a lot to do with this pattern, don't show a lot. Kind of that's it. Like if they want electron transport parameters, if they want any of those deep, like all that tangle of information in that leaf diagram I told you, if they want those things, we don't have them. So this is a proof that maybe we can work together, but we don't have the information that facilitates them bringing this work in. So my last section is about a new grant that's starting up, that's funded by NASA, and the lead investigator is Lauren Albert at West Virginia University. Here's some lead PIs with me from both NASA and University of Twente, and then more people, we're hiring more people on. So it's going to be a really neat group. And it's about quantifying leaf to landscape predictors of tropical forest drought vulnerability through ISS observation model integration. It seemed like the catchy title at the time. This is one of those titles I haven't read that title, and I'm like, well, we chose that, I guess. Okay, but it's very descriptive. Like so you get, I think you get the idea. If you don't know what ISS is, it's this. It's the International Space Station. So the International Space Station not only is good for photo ops and funny little experiments with ants, they have these docking bays that you can put together an instrument, design it, it gets approved, and they send it up there and they dock it in, and it's used for a while. And so there are a number of instruments up there now or recently that point at Earth and are relevant to the kind of work that we do in forest ecology. And of course, NASA wants these instruments to be used, so they have little calls for proposal, and this one was a carbon call focused on the tropics. In other words, can you use these instruments? So, this isn't like, of all the instruments in the world, we'd want these. It's like, please use these instruments, because we spend a lot of money on them, to help us understand carbon cycling in the tropics. But it is exciting, and I think that there is a lot of potential. So the four instruments that we're working with are DSIS, EcoStress, JEDI, and OCO3, and then Tropemy is a satellite. We're also using satellite, partly because you may not know this, but when you start to look into the data, the ISS, the International Space Station, does not have a regular orbit. It is a car being driven by different people for different reasons. It like goes to the grocery store, it does this, picks up the kids, whatever. It zigzags around the Earth, and it's not like a satellite that just covers the Earth every 16 days, or geosynchronized where it stays in the same place all the time. We don't know where it's going to be next. It's that. We can ask it to like aim a little bit sometimes, this or that. So that's why we have satellites for other coverage. And it's also one reason why it's not so perfect, because you can't say, give me all the information you have on this plot, this forest plot. And they're like, we have 2 days last March. We might have another day, next month, and that's it. But sometimes you can get lots of regular scenes. So these different instruments do different things. Basically, forest structure and function. Just think of it that way. You know, where things are, that's Jedi, and then what's going on with those things. How green is it? How much chlorophyll? How much nitrogen? That kind of thing. So we're going to get all this information, but we want to ground truth it to some degree, like link it to some of the things that we think about in the biodiversity vein. And this is just a graphic I put together for the proposal to give them a sense, NASA people, a sense of what we even mean when we're talking about scaling up a plot. So here's Barro Colorado Island in Panama. It's one of the big plots in the Smithsonian network. It's 50 hectares, so it's a kilometer by half a kilometer. Every stem represented is 1 centimeter or more. And I just like, so, and there's elevational gradients. So we would expect maybe drought response to be different at hills or ridges or valleys. So here's every stem with a loose color association. Here's all the big stems that could be in the canopy. And here are the actual trees big enough that we would think are in the canopy. This is a cartoon version, except, you know, the location's accurate, but it's a cartoon version to say, look, there's lots of trees, and then of those trees, some of them can be in the canopy, and we think might be players in this game of drought that we can see from space. And here are the actual trees we do think we can see from space. And the coloring isn't that good right here, but you can see, like, I basically took what would effectively be the footprint, a smaller section, and those pixels, those big pixels, are the footprint of the machines, of the instruments. So 30 by 30 pixels sometimes, 50 by 50 pixels for others. So there's these big blocks, and if you have a small plot, you're not going to get a lot of information. But when we do get a scene, we're going to get lots of kind of little blurry integrated patterns of the trees on the ground. So what we want to do is measure those trees like crazy for the parameters that the models like. So not SLA, not wood density, but we're going to get these and put Licors, if you know these Licor instruments, or anything that can measure photosynthesis under different temperatures, CO2, this and that, stress, chlorophyll content to see how active things are. There's a bunch of things that we can do. And we're going to integrate all this with this model called SCOPE, another acronym that's a mouthful. What's exciting about SCOPE and why it became the centerpiece of this is it's a canopy model, and it both models, the things, the parameters. It uses a lot of the parameters that the Earth system models need. So photosynthetic parameters, like very detailed. It also models how light moves through the canopy, bounces around, activates photosynthesis, respiration, what have you, and leaves, or is fluoresced, because part of photosynthesis creates a photon that can be picked up. That's solar-induced fluorescence, which is kind of a new field in this, where if you can detect that photon, you can say, oh, this is how much you're photosynthesizing. So this model not only takes the sun coming in and does the photosynthesis and the carbon cycling in the canopy, it actually says, when the carbon cycle is moving like this, here's what it will look like from space. And so this is why it's such a key model for us, is that we can integrate this with the data we're getting from the ISS stations. So this is a move towards this. Now, it seems super risky, or what we called in the plot cutting edge science. So how do you get, I'm including this gratuitously because maybe in a year, I'll never show this again. But you know, you want something like this to collect in the canopy, and usually it's like shotguns or crossbows. But this is this new Dleaves machine from this group in Quebec. And yes, you hover, this like grabs a branch and it saws it and brings it back to you. So again, in a year, I might be like, that's horrible, it never worked, you know, like, but it's very exciting because one of the big challenges in tropical forests of getting these kinds of traits is actually getting to where the stuff matters, which is at the top of the canopy. And we have to for this project, because that's what the instruments from space are looking at. So we're doing this, we're focusing these field campaigns on 4 sites, 2 in Malaysia, Amazon and BCI and Panama. But I think, and then the little purple things are flux towers, because another part of this model is to integrate it in an ecosystem scale with carbon cycling in the canopy. But then these other dots are other forest geoplots where we at least have the species name, size, et cetera, so that if we get pictures of them, because as I said, you know, the space station's coming over and it's grabbing stuff from everywhere. So we know it's going to grab stuff from some of our plots. We've checked that. But there's other plots that it will get from. And it will also collect in between them. This is places like that picture of the Amazon I showed you at the beginning, that I grabbed from Google Earth. It's going to get that. It's going to get instrument readings from that. So what do you do with them? What we hope to do is have this model tell us much more about what those readings mean. So that in the middle of the Amazon, we can say, here are the plant functional types we see. Or here's how this plant functional type seems to be behaving as it moves from the wetter Western Amazon to the drier Eastern Amazon. So maybe between the plant functional types and the roaming leaf approach, we're going to be able to start to fill this in. I'm really excited about this project because I think, as I've explained to you, it is at this interesting nexus of the biodiversity and the global modeling thing. One thing that's particularly exciting is that we're not alone doing this. I mean, I think that, you know, this is adventurous. There's a lot of new equipment that we're using, new data, but we're not the only ones doing that. In fact, yesterday at a lab meeting in AMA, a couple of presenters who were just casually presenting work we're doing presented similar things or things adjacent to this type of work. And to me, that's very exciting because when you look at these two strains that I've discussed, the biodiversity strain and the global modeling strain, you know, this represents the efforts of thousands of researchers over decades. So, you know, this isn't just a few people handing an idea off through their lab. And so I think this blending, it's not surprising that the blending would take a lot of work from a lot of people and a lot of creativity and a lot of ability to learn about how others approach a problem, why they approach it that way, why they can't approach it some other ways. And so part of this exercise for me, especially kind of looking back through the history of the global modeling, is understanding why we're here now and how to move forward, understanding that progress. And so I finished by just saying for early career, for me, I can kind of be amazed at this other group that's worked so long on force dynamics that has nothing to do with how I've worked on force dynamics. But for early career scientists, I think it can be intimidating because you're developing your expertise and then you're seeing these other people doing things like adjacent with their own histories and their own literature, own technical experience and tools. And so what might be exciting for me, it may be intimidating, but I will just say that not only is that the future, it should be the future, and you will always have your expertise. And I think the trick, and just as they will, and they probably feel the same way, that like, don't tell me how many species are on the Amazon, you know, I only have 2 plant functional types. Be proud of your expertise, but also actively like think and talk and listen to these other groups, because I think the faster we kind of get the scientific cultures, the ways of thinking about these systems down, the faster we'll be able to integrate our knowledge and build it collectively. And these problems that I'm talking about, I mean, the early career scientists, this is the environment I think that you're going to be working in, and it will not be as isolated as some of my past has been. And certainly, that's no longer my future. As I think I could explain the people that I work with now that do all different kinds of things. So thanks for your time. I would really appreciate it.
Thanks, Sean, for a great talk. If you have questions in the room, we're gonna have questions in the room.
Do 9 minutes of silence.
Lawrence?
Can you show the graph with the effects of the niche of the species on their geographic habitat? What I understand is if you have a high rate pressure deficit niche, then you're more sensitive to increased vegetation.
If where you are in the plot, correct me if I'm wrong, if the plot in which the species is found is towards the extreme of its biogeographic range of VPD, you're more vulnerable. So yeah, so if you take a huge range of an individual and it goes from wet to dry, if the plot you're in reflects one of those drier parts, then you see more vulnerability.
And what's the mechanism?
What's that?
What's the mechanism? Why
It's VPD, man. We came in a bunch of different ways, and the reason why VPD showed up a bunch of times. So this is, and I think of it not as BPD per se, but stress. Like, so, again, these data are, again, to my point about what the modelers want, like they want 8-minute BPD data because those leaves are responding in their models every 8 minutes to BPD. We have like integrations over 5 years with data that we average by month, et cetera, et cetera. And so, so to see a signal, I think is kind of impressive because I would expect BPD to be peaking in the afternoons, for example, and repeatedly peaking means repeated stress. And interactions are also going to be important, especially for tree mortality. These are long-lived organisms and usually it takes multiple causes. So for example, BPD could weaken a tree that then gets blown over by a storm. And there are periodic cyclones in some of these, that hit some of these plots. So I think that the reason we see the trend is something like BPD because it's a climate-driven shift that we're not seeing in other things. The actual causes are multiple.
But also, we also use temperature, the maximum temperature in these models. And there was a model where we only had temperature and one we had both. And when you only had temperature, the effect of temperature was so big. But then when you add BPD, because you know that temperature causes BPD, you actually see BPD would catch most of the effect. Which was tended to indicate that it was mostly BPD that temperature had an effect on mortality.
Any questions for?
I have a question that is more curiosity. I think it's in the previous graph here that was the mortality risk and the BPD. No. Yeah, this one. What's happening those years in 2013?
Right. So we, it's an increase in mortality, a spike. It wasn't, it wasn't just like one species just disappeared or one site, but there was an increase, an aggregate increase there. And these aren't huge plots, so I would say those are stochastic little mortality events. Sort of, it's the manifestation of a bad year, but I wouldn't say those are bad years because, and then this is important to remember, because of the multiple ways and the pace at which these things happen. We look for like a cyclone that came and knocked everything down. That's not it. For whatever reason, weakness was collected, and there was a little jump across a bunch of plots there. But I think of it more as things becoming more vulnerable, and then every once in a while something happens that kills a bit more.
So yeah, I'm not a specialist of this field, but I was just wondering. So isn't it the case that accounting for this diversity of plant functional types would be useful in things that have to do with okay, so using theory about stability and things like that, including this diversity might help predict the critical transition, tipping point, this type of thing that people working in climate model are really looking after.
Right.
So don't you think that this specific topic of transition is one perhaps where biodiversity analysis coming from ecology could help more than others? Or?
That's a great point. It's really interesting, and you see the diagrams of how multiple species in network theory, like with different amounts of connections between nodes or what have you, can create stability, but it also can create chaos. And I think that, and I know this, that they add a PFT and they create chaos very often. And so I think what they would want is exactly that. Can you add species to a system where you really are, for example, with different niches moderating ecosystem services, so that some things kind of keep certain nutrients, like having a nitrogen fixer. I mean, you can imagine exactly that, and I think they would want that. Probably for the same reason, though they're reluctant to include, soil microbiome, is it's more likely to break it than to fix it first pass. But I'll talk to, I kind of misrepresent them because the big models certainly go through that 5-year push, but within that, there's lots of other groups doing things, and in fact, you can use these models offline, as it were, to play with. And I think that I wondered if someone's doing something like that. It's a great idea. Or get someone on that.
Is that it?
Thank you very much for your talk. I have two questions if I may. One concerning the data from the ISS. You are using or determining what's adding by using those data compared to satellite data. For example, I can get those finals or for the question of resolution or spatial resolution. And my second question is about the scope model. If you could say more about how it will work.
Yeah, okay. So for the first part, the number one reason why we're using
I'm just going to repeat quickly for
What's
the
that?
people on Zoom. I'm just going to repeat the
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
question. So the question was about what's the added bonus of using the products from the ISS station for the starting NASA grant, and more details about the scope model.
So the short answer about the ISS station is the advantage is about $1 million because that's what they told us to use. So NASA said, use the space station data and we'll give you $1 million if we like the proposal. That was the call. So that's it's not for satellite data. We have access to satellite data to try to stitch things together. On the non-cynical side of it, I think you do have some very different instruments that are looking at the same place at the same time that have pretty rigorous public teams of people converting those data into usable products. They're known quantities and they're doing like phased data. So it's not just here's the raw data or here's a very expensive product that we kind of know how it works. So it's much more open that way. And so I think that is an advantage for it. Be glad to talk to my colleagues at NASA who might have, well, I think that's what I get from them. That's what I do. As far as the scope model, so I'm getting my head around the scope model. It's a canopy model that, and I don't know the time step of it, but it's probably pretty fast because it's taking light inputs, leaf area, so LAI, leaf layers, leaf angle. So it's really trying to get those physics right. So you have leaf angles or clusters of leaves, and you're trying to get the light coming in from a certain angle, bouncing it around. So all the features of the leaves that would allow light to reflect or diffuse through. Then all the properties that we want to get with the light cores of, chlorophyll content, photosynthetic capacity, maximum photosynthetic rates under different conditions, et cetera. So it basically, whatever leaves it's hitting, the light's hitting, and the temperature, CO2 concentrations, it starts running and calculating all that. And it takes the light and bounces it back out, and it takes any solar-induced fluorescence and bounces that out, and it creates estimates of canopy level GPP that you can use a flux tower to kind of test. So to be clear, so Christian, developed this. It's a version 2 now, and it's been used a bunch in boreal sites. It's a pretty big jump to go to the tropics, but we're doing it. We're excited about it because it really does answer a lot of the, how to get the model parameters that they like, how to relate it to trees on the ground that we know, and then what we could see from space is kind of a perfect mix in this state. So I think Christian's also looking forward to working with us and seeing how the model can advance. This is a pretty small thing, but he wants it to be integrated into DGBM. So.
We have a question online.
So there is Etsuko Nomaka who has asked me to read the question actually. So he has asked, do or will this model consider evolution? Maybe some species or populations could have higher potential to adapt to new environments and causes. And what about phenotypic plasticity?
Great question. From the evolution side, I think, well, in my explanation of the two different streams, there's really no evolution in the carbon stream. Like that's not how they're, especially the time frame that they're looking at, and the physical quantities that they're looking at. They're not thinking of in situ evolution. I often, again, the time frame we're talking about, there can be selection for traits under high pressure and with great variation. And I think that there's no reason why there wouldn't be, for example, a variety of seedlings in a major drought, and the survivors of that will have traits that will differ and can move the population. How that translates into the forests and the forest dynamics that we're talking about globally, I think that's too slow a system to really, for that to be a priority. Evolution might be more important, I think, in perhaps ocean systems and phytoplankton and faster turnover. And the second question was
Plasticity.
Plasticity. Yeah, that's great. And I think that really what it's not the literal approach or the technical approach that using, but the roaming leaf is essentially phenotypic plasticity. It's just saying, if I take a leaf from Montpellier and put it in the Amazon, it is perfectly capable of being perfectly plastic and responding, but it will respond according to the environment of the Amazon. And therefore, it will be more productive. It will be on for longer periods. It won't be dropped during a cold winter, et cetera. So I think that is a critical thing. And in identifying the limits of plasticity, I think, is a challenge. So we can assume perfect plasticity, or we can assume everything does its own thing and it's very rigid. Obviously, the truth is in the middle. And as people that know in theory of phenotypic plasticity or experiments, it's easy to kind of demonstrate, but difficult to know the whole parameters. But that's a great question.
So thank you, Sean, for a
Thank
great
you.
seminar.
Yeah, thanks
Thank you,
everybody.
everyone, for
It's really
coming.
nice to meet you.
And again, if you want to meet with Sean, he's in Montpellier until the end of May.
Great. Thanks.